The tropical sun hung low over the northern coastline of Île-de-France, modern Mauritius, casting long, wavering shadows through the thick jungle canopy. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, soaked with the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves. A narrow track wound its way inland from Grand Bay, a strip of trampled soil where British boots had churned the ground into a dark, muddy ribbon. Here, on the morning of the sea, the 30th of November, 1810, a vanguard of roughly 800 British regulars, sepoys, marines and sailors pressed steadily forward. Their scarlet coats, darkened with sweat, clung to their backs as if the island itself were trying to pull them down into the forest. It was a miserable, punishing advance. 5 miles separated the landing point at Grand Bay from the French-held capital, Port Napoleon. But every foot of it drove the invading force deeper into a world wholly different from the familiar battlefields of Europe. The jungle swallowed sound, muffled movement, and constricted vision. Vines twisted over the path, like ropes left behind by some ancient shipwreck. Palm fronds dripped with condensation, and the air clung to skin like warm, wet cloth. Even seasoned sepoys, no strangers to heat, struggled in this oppressive humidity. This was the spearhead of Chow, Major General John Abercrombie's Chow's invasion force, an expedition of nearly 6,800 soldiers and sailors, delivered by a fleet of over 70 ships to destroy the last French stronghold in the Indian Ocean. The British Empire's lifeline to India had been tormented for years by French frigates striking from Mauritius and neighbouring Isle Bonaparte, capturing East Indiamen and raiding along vital trade routes. The island had become a nest of maritime predators, shielded by reefs, storms, and a difficult coastline. Now at last, the British had come ashore to end it. Leading the vanguard inland was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Sheehy Keating, an officer already tested by years of jungle and mountain fighting during earlier raids and the successful 1810 conquest of Isle Bonaparte. His men were a mixed but formidable group, companies from regiments such as the 69th, 84th, 14th and 19th Foot, detachments of Madras sepoys, and a hardened naval brigade under Captain William Augustus Montague, men accustomed to hauling guns across beaches and storming batteries under fire. Their orders were simple and brutal: push forward, clear the jungle track, and reach the approaches to Port Napoleon before the French could fully consolidate their defense. But nature itself resisted the march. The heat was devastating. Leaves hung limp from branches, as though even the plants could not endure the climate. Not a single stream offered relief. Officers and enlisted men alike collapsed as the march stretched into agony. Among the casualties were respected figures. Captain Yates, who had only joined the column as a temporary visitor from a passing Indiaman, and Lieutenant Dove of the 14th Regiment. Both men succumbed to heat and exhaustion long before the first musket shot cracked in anger. Yet the vanguard continued. The dry crackle of shifting equipment and the dull clink of bayonets brushing against canteens broke the monotony of the jungle. Light companies moved ahead in open order, their red and green plumes bobbing in the undergrowth as they scouted for French militia. The dense vegetation forced the column to stretch into a long, vulnerable line, each man sandwiched between the rear files and the choking green walls on either side. But even in this stifling gloom there was purpose. Every step inland brought them closer to the French defensive line forming beyond the jungle. General Edmé Martin van der Meissen, commanding the regular troops of Governor d'As, Charles de Caen, had assembled his men on rising ground near the capital. Veteran infantry, elite marines landed from French frigates, and colonial militia units whose reliability was uncertain at best. Behind them sat Port Napoleon and its harbour, clogged with French frigates, Astrée, Bellone, Manche, Minerve, crewed by sailors who now fought as infantry. By nightfall of the 30th, Keating's exhausted vanguard reached Moulin à Poudre, a key point along the approach to the capital. Here the trees opened slightly, revealing patches of grassland and sugarcane. The men collapsed onto their packs, chests heaving, uniforms drenched. The smell of salt, sweat, and soaked powder hung over the bivouac. They had survived the march, but the battle ahead still waited in the morning mists beyond the last edge of the jungle. In that steaming darkness, as insects buzzed and the sea's distant surf echoed faintly behind them, the vanguard prepared for the confrontation that would end French power in the Indian Ocean. The fate of merchant convoys, trade routes, and two empires' ambitions rested on the next day's advance. To understand why hundreds of British soldiers now lay exhausted beneath the jungle canopy of Ile-de-France, one must look back to the years preceding this desperate march. The campaign for Mauritius did not arise suddenly. It was the culmination of a long, grinding struggle for control over the Indian Ocean. One fought with frigates, blockade lines, and daring amphibious raids across thousands of miles of open sea. Since 1809, French naval commanders such as Jacques Amelin and Guy Victor Duperrey had turned Mauritius and nearby Isle Bonaparte into a predatory twin fortress. From these islands they launched fast, aggressive frigate operations, hunting British merchant convoys and crippling the East India trade route. Their ships, especially the powerful frigates Venus, Bellone, Astray, and others, roamed the shipping lanes with near impunity, capturing East Indiamen and striking at British prestige in a region assumed to be secure. The British response was slow at first, constrained by obligations across the globe. But frustration mounted. Commanders at the Cape and in India realized that as long as these islands remained in French hands, British commerce would bleed. To isolate Mauritius, the Royal Navy first seized the tiny island of Rodriguez, transforming it into a staging ground, an arc of isolated land halfway to nowhere, now repurposed as a logistical knife point aimed squarely at the French. From Rodriguez, the British launched their earliest blows. In 1809, they struck at St. Paul. On Isle Bonaparte, using naval brigades and line battalions to smash through coastal batteries. These raids were more than harassment, they were rehearsals. Under commanders such as Commodore Josias Rowley, officers and sailors learned how to coordinate landings, storm fortifications, and fight through rugged terrain under tropical skies. The success at St. Paul emboldened them. In July 1810, a British force under Lieutenant Henry Sheehy Keating invaded Isle Bonaparte itself. This operation was a textbook example of British amphibious warfare. Coordinated landings, light troops in the vanguard, naval guns hauled inland, and flanking movements that bypassed French strongholds. After only a brief campaign, the island fell, depriving Mauritius of a key defensive partner. But the French struck back with fury. Barely a month later, in August 1810, the Royal Navy suffered one of its most humiliating defeats of the Napoleonic era, the Battle of Grand Port. Navigating treacherous waters to force entry into a fortified bay, a British squadron became trapped on reefs, battered by French shore positions, and overwhelmed by 3 enemy frigates under Duperrey's command. Over 2 days of brutal fighting, 4 British frigates were lost. The setback was so notable that Napoleon had the victory engraved on the Arc de Triomphe. The British could not allow such a humiliation to stand, and they did not. In September, Rowley's forces seized the initiative once more. A British frigate squadron captured Hamelin himself, along with his flagship, Venus, marking a devastating blow to French naval strength. With their offensive power diminished and their ships battered from years of raiding, the French position on Mauritius grew precarious. Now the matter was clear. Only a full-scale invasion would end French raiding forever. The British assembled everything they could: troops from Bombay, sepoys from Madras, naval brigades, marines, artillery, and transport fleets from across the Indian Ocean. Vice Admiral Albert Alberti oversaw the naval movement while Major General John Abercrombie took command of the land forces. By late November 1810, the invasion force, some 6,148 soldiers and sailors, massed at Rodriguez. Their ships, dozens of them, crowded the lagoon like a floating city. Orders were drawn, regiments sorted, ammunition distributed. The soldiers knew the task ahead was formidable: a fortified island, a determined French governor, and the punishing realities of climate and terrain. But they also knew something else. The French were isolated. No relief fleet could come. No reinforcements could arrive. On me, 29th November. The Armada sailed west. By nightfall, it anchored in Grand Bay. The scents of land, damp vegetation and volcanic soil drifted across the water. Under the last glow of daylight, boats splashed into the sea, carrying Keating's first wave ashore. The landings were unopposed. The real challenge lay inland. What followed was the exhausting march already underway in Section 1, a trial of endurance rather than fire. Even before reaching French shot, the British paid dearly to the climate. The cost of reaching the battlefield became part of the battle itself. Now, as dawn prepared to rise on 1 December, the vanguard near Moulins à Poudre awaited orders. Ahead of them lay Port Napoleon, and between them and the capital stood General van der Meisen's final line, a mix of French regulars, naval infantry, and unreliable militia holding the last hope of French resistance in the Indian Ocean. The confrontation was inevitable, and it would unfold within hours. The morning of 1st December 1810 rose slowly over Mauritius, casting pale gold light across the sugarcane fields and broken scrubland that marked the final approach to Port Napoleon. As the British vanguard stirred from its exhausted bivouac near Moulins à Poudre, a very different army was taking shape a few miles ahead. There, on a ridge of gently rising ground overlooking the final stretch of the jungle track, General Edmé Martin van der Meissen assembled the last effective French force capable of resisting the British invasion. The French position was carefully chosen. The ridge commanded the road leading from Grand Bay, offering clear fields of fire and enough space to deploy regular infantry in disciplined formations. To the left and right, patches of thick vegetation and cane provided natural cover, though they also constrained movement. Behind this line, the outskirts of Port Napoleon stretched toward the harbour, where frigates, Astrée, Bellone, Manche, Minerve, and others, lay anchored, their crews now fighting on land as improvised marines. These sailors and naval gunners, hardened by years at sea and accustomed to the roar of cannon fire, formed a significant portion of van der Meisen's strength. The general also commanded roughly 1,300 regular French troops, a modest but capable force of European-trained soldiers. On paper, thousands of colonial militia supported them, but their reliability had proven fragile. Many had vanished at the first sight of British uniforms. Those who remained were scattered in small detachments, more observers than a fighting formation. Van der Meissen understood the gravity of his task. The French Indian Ocean base, cultivated for years by Governor Charles de Caen, now depended entirely on this field line. If he could halt the British advance, even briefly, there was a chance, however slim, that attrition, heat, disease, or miscommunication might slow the British enough to force a negotiated withdrawal. But if his line collapsed, Port Napoleon would fall, and with it, the last French stronghold in the region. As dawn strengthened, French troops formed in traditional Napoleonic deployment. Long, two-rank lines, stretching across the ridge, with cannons positioned at intervals to command the open ground below. Officers paced behind the ranks, steadying their men. The colourful mix of uniforms, French blue of the regulars, white coats of colonial units, darker garments of naval marines, presented a patchwork force, yet one still determined to stand. Across the fields, the British vanguard prepared to resume its advance. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Sheehy Keating had regrouped his weary men, integrating light companies, sepoys, marines, and the naval brigade under Captain William Augustus Montague. Although reduced by exhaustion, the vanguard retained its discipline. Muskets were checked, cartridge boxes inspected, water rationed. The men knew the march had drained them, yet they also understood their role. They were the tip of Abercrombie's force, the spearhead that had to break the French position before the main body arrived. The terrain ahead presented difficulties. The open ground beneath the ridge was broken by scrub, stones, and uneven soil. To either side, thickets of vegetation created blind spots where small units might move unseen. Keating's understanding of this terrain, honed during prior campaigns on Isle Bonaparte, guided his plan. Instead of a straightforward assault up the centre, an action that would expose his men to French cannon fire, he would rely on coordinated pressure. A frontal advance to pin the French line, while flanking elements probed the weaker edges. Before the movement began, the atmosphere settled into an eerie quiet. A damp breeze drifted in from the sea, carrying with it the tang of salt and the distant murmur of waves. The rising heat pressed down upon the soldiers, sweat gathering beneath shakos and dripping from the edges of cartridge boxes. The tension of impending battle hung in the air, palpable even to the veterans who had faced combat many times before. At mid-morning, Keating's column emerged from the last of the jungle cover. Their scarlet coats formed a sharp line against the green, and as they advanced, the metallic glint of bayonets caught the light. Light companies fanned out before them, moving in scattered order to test French positions. The British artillery, light field pieces brought ashore by the Naval Brigade, rumbled forward, ready to support the infantry once firing began. On the ridge, French guns opened first. The thunder of their discharge rolled across the open ground, followed moments later by the heavy, whining descent of round shot smashing into earth and kicking dust into the air. British companies adjusted their intervals, maintaining formation even as cannonballs tore furrows through the soil. In response, Keating ordered the steady advance to continue. British muskets remained silent as the lines closed the distance, their discipline unbroken. At around 100 yards, the front ranks halted briefly, raised their Brown Bess muskets, and unleashed the first British volley of the day. The crack of hundreds of muskets erupted like tearing canvas, adding thick smoke to the humid air. Across the ridge, Vandermason's line stirred, returning fire in disciplined volleys of their own. The battlefield dissolved into a haze of gunpowder, drifting over the fields in white sheets that clung to the sweating soldiers. Visibility shrank. Only the thunder of firing and the shouted orders of officers guided the formations. The first stage of the battle had begun, and both sides understood that the next hours would determine the fate of Mauritius. Keating's vanguard had survived the jungle. Now it had to break the French line. The battle intensified as noon approached, turning the fields before Port Napoleon into a blistering arena of smoke, heat, and relentless musketry. The ridge occupied by General Vandermason's forces had become a jagged silhouette behind drifting powder clouds. From its crest, the French poured steady volleys into the advancing British, determined to hold the high ground for as long as possible. But the British vanguard, hardened by the torturous march through jungle and driven by the urgency of securing the island, continued its advance with measured precision. The centre of the British line, composed of redcoats from regiments such as the 169th and 84th Foot, absorbed the brunt of the French fire. These battalions formed the backbone of Keating's plan, stepping forward in tight, disciplined ranks despite the constant whistle of incoming shot. The men moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm that had been drilled into them since their earliest days as recruits. Their muskets were raised and fired in controlled volleys, each discharge producing a rolling wave of crackling thunder that echoed back across the fields. Yet the cost of this steady march was severe. The open ground offered little protection. Round shot tore through files, flinging men to the earth in violent arcs. Shrapnel from French case shot burst overhead, showering fragments of iron onto the British ranks. Some soldiers fell silently, while others stumbled forward, clinging to their weapons before collapsing. Still the line closed its gaps, maintaining its shape like a living machine advancing through fire. Behind the firing lines, the Naval Brigade under Captain Montague laboured to drag their light artillery into position. These were sailors accustomed to deck guns and sea fog, now sweating under the weight of wheels and limbers as they pushed through broken ground. Once their pieces were aligned, the naval gunners loaded and fired with the efficiency of men who had spent years working the broadsides of frigates. Their guns spat flame and smoke, sending round shot arcing toward the ridge where the French artillery crews struggled to maintain control. Keating, observing the battlefield, knew the frontal fight could only achieve so much. The centre's role was to pin Van der Meisen's line, to fix it in place under the weight of musketry. The decisive blow would come elsewhere. To the British right, sepoy detachments and light companies began to edge into the scrub and thickets that flanked the ridge. Their movements were slow and cautious, using the vegetation as cover while they probed for weaknesses in the French position. Here, the difference in training became crucial. French militia, already shaken by the sudden appearance of British troops earlier in the campaign, struggled to hold firm in the broken ground. Their formations wavered as British skirmishers pushed closer, firing by pairs and advancing from tree to stone, using the natural terrain to their advantage. The militia fired sporadically, their shots mostly lost in the thick foliage, while the British pressed on with characteristic patience. On the French left, the situation grew worse. Sailors turned infantry, brave but inexperienced in land warfare, attempted to cover gaps in the shrinking line. Their officers encouraged them to hold the ridge, but years aboard deck did little to prepare them for fighting on uneven soil under relentless infantry assault. Discipline began to fray. Men shifted nervously, recoiling from the steady push of the British light infantry. The turning point came when the British flanking parties finally slipped through the last veil of scrub and began to emerge on Van der Meisen's flank. From this vantage point, they could fire obliquely into the length of the French line, a devastating angle that threatened to roll the entire formation like a breaking wave. Van der Meisen's officers recognized the danger at once. They attempted to reform elements of the line, but the terrain and growing panic made it impossible. In the center, the British Redcoats saw the French line destabilizing. Their volleys grew sharper and more confident, driving home the pressure that had been building since the first shots of the morning. Smoke drifted upward in slow spirals, clinging to the ridge and reducing the French silhouettes to wavering, uncertain shapes. Amid this choking haze, the French line began to buckle. The retreat, once begun, spread rapidly. It started on the left, where militia units dissolved into the brush, then swept to the right as regulars attempted to pull back toward the town. Van der Meisen fought to impose order, but momentum had turned irrevocably. The British flanking parties pressed forward, threatening to encircle portions of the French force. To avoid being trapped, the French withdrew in uneven groups, stumbling down the reverse slope toward Port Napoleon. The ridge, the last natural barrier before the capital, was now in British hands. As the French fell back toward the outskirts of the town, Keating pushed the vanguard onward. Redcoats advanced over ground littered with dropped packs, broken muskets and bodies. The thick veil of smoke parted to reveal the French retreat snaking toward the harbour, where the frigates lay silent in the water, their hulls reflecting the harsh tropical light. The battle for Port Napoleon was entering its final stage. The French had not been destroyed by sheer force, but by a combination of discipline, flanking manoeuvres, and the exhaustion of a garrison stretched beyond its limits. The British momentum was overwhelming. Abercrombie's main force was close behind, ready to press the advantage. The collapse of Van der Meisen's line marked the beginning of the end for French rule in the Indian Ocean. The collapse of Van der Meisen's ridgeline opened the final pathway to Port Napoleon, and the British vanguard advanced with renewed momentum. The battered French defenders streamed downhill toward the capital, their retreat unfolding in broken, disorganized groups. The once cohesive line, anchored on the ridge only an hour before, had dissolved into knots of men scrambling through cane fields and narrow lanes that led into the outskirts of the town. Some carried their wounded comrades, others threw away muskets in the hope of moving faster. Officers attempted to rally them, but the chain of command frayed under the weight of exhaustion and fear. As the British descended from the ridge, the landscape shifted. The open ground gave way to cultivated fields and scattered clusters of trees, leading into the northern edges of the capital. The sea once again came into view, its shimmering blue surface broken by the silhouettes of the French frigates at anchor. These warships, once the terror of British convoys, now stood immobilized, trapped by the invasion force that surrounded the island. Many of their crews had already fought the British on land. Others remained aboard, powerless spectators to the unfolding defeat. Governor Charles de Caen, the commander-in-chief of French forces on Mauritius, observed the developing situation with grim clarity. He had long believed that the island was Napoleon's foothold in the Indian Ocean, the base from which France could disrupt British commerce in India and undermine the empire's eastern territories. For years, he had resisted British naval pressure, sustained by the skillful raids of French frigates and the defensive advantages of the island's coastline. But now, standing in the capital and receiving reports of Van der Meisen's retreat, he confronted the reality that the British had pierced the island's last terrestrial shield. De Caen understood that if the British seized Port Napoleon itself, any attempt at organized resistance would collapse instantly. The city held the island's military infrastructure, its remaining supplies, and its harbor defenses. Losing it meant losing everything. But the governor's options were painfully limited. Reinforcements were impossible. France could spare no fleet. His militia units had evaporated at the sight of disciplined British lines. His regulars were few and exhausted, and his frigates, constrained by geography and numerical inferiority, could neither fight nor flee. Meanwhile, Keating's vanguard approached the outskirts of the town. The British had pushed with relentless determination through the ridgeline, but they were now acutely aware of their own condition. The tropical heat had been punishing all morning. Smoke clung to the air, turning the sunlight into a blinding white haze. Thirst gnawed at the men, and ammunition needed to be redistributed among the ranks. Still, the Redcoats pressed forward, seizing minor positions and clearing pockets of French resistance in gardens, courtyards, and along narrow lanes leading toward the heart of the capital. Behind them, the main body of Major General Abercrombie's force was rapidly closing the distance. As more British regiments poured out of the jungle and into the open ground beyond the ridge, their numbers surged into the thousands. Artillery, marines, sepoys, and regular infantry stretched across the landscape, their columns forming an overwhelming display of imperial power. The psychological impact was immediate. French morale, which had clung desperately to the hope of stopping the vanguard, now faced the unmistakable truth. The full British army was arriving, and its strength dwarfed anything de Caen could muster. Inside Port Napoleon, French officers conferred anxiously. Some urged a last stand within the town's streets, perhaps leveraging the maze of alleys and built-up areas to stall the British advance. Others argued that further resistance would be futile and only inflict needless casualties. The reality was stark. The French troops were outnumbered, outflanked, and exhausted. Their line had been turned, their troops scattered, and the British now held the initiative completely. By late afternoon, the British vanguard had reached positions where they could dominate approaches to the harbour. Keating's men halted temporarily to reorganize and await orders. Soldiers slumped against walls, their uniforms soaked through with sweat, their faces streaked with grime and powder. Officers walked the lines, checking ammunition, repositioning companies, and preparing for the possibility of urban fighting should the French fight on. But the next act of the campaign would not be written with musket volleys or bayonet charges. It would be settled by discussion, not bloodshed. As night approached, de Caen realized he had no meaningful path to victory. Any attempt to defend the capital would be crushed by the British main force arriving in waves. His men were dwindling in strength, ammunition was low, and the harbour's frigates could not escape the tightening noose of British naval superiority. The moment called for a decision not of pride, but of preservation. And thus, as the sun dipped beyond the horizon and night swept across Port Napoleon, the French governor initiated negotiations. The final act of the campaign had begun, not on the battlefield, but at the table. The British had marched through jungle, endured heat, fought a pitched battle, and now stood ready to claim the ultimate prize, the fall of Mauritius. Night settled over Port Napoleon, with a quiet heaviness, a stark contrast to the thundering volleys and cannon blasts that had echoed across the island only hours earlier. The humid air still held the lingering scent of gunpowder. Wisps of smoke drifted lazily through the dusky streets, illuminated only by lanterns and the occasional flicker of reflection from the anchored frigates in the harbour. For the weary British soldiers who had fought their way across the ridge and into the outskirts of the capital, the evening brought a rare moment of stillness, yet beneath that calm lay the tension of unfinished business. Within the town, Governor Charles de Caen retreated into consideration. He had spent years shaping Mauritius into a bastion of French power, training its garrison, developing its infrastructure, and encouraging naval operations that had harassed British shipping to devastating effect. His vision had always been clear. Mauritius was not merely a colony, but a strategic dagger aimed at the heart of British trade. For this reason, de Caen had always vowed to defend it fiercely. But reality now stood in stark contrast to ambition. Reports flowed into the governor's headquarters throughout the night. They were uniformly grim. General Van der Mason's line had been shattered. Militia were fleeing into the interior, unwilling to regroup. Regular troops were depleted, many wounded or missing. Naval Marines who had fought bravely on land were exhausted, their formations in disarray. Ammunition reserves were dangerously low, and the British, having taken the ridge, were flooding the island in overwhelming numbers. De Caen understood that the British commander, Major General Abercrombie, held every advantage. Abercrombie's main body had now reached the outskirts of the city, and by morning the British would be in full control of the approaches, able to strike at any quarter they chose. Worse still, de Caen's frigates, once symbols of defiance, could neither escape nor mount an effective defence. Their crews had been bled on the battlefield, and British naval forces dominated the approaches to the harbour. Thus, before dawn had reached the island's volcanic peaks, de Caen made the most difficult decision of his career. He sought parley, enfoncer. 3rd of December, 1810. French envoys approached the British lines under a flag of truce. They crossed streets scattered with spent cartridges, broken wheels, and abandoned equipment. French wounded lay in makeshift shelters, their whispered groans mixing with the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbour wall. The envoys carried de Caen's request to open negotiations for surrender. Abercrombie received the request with characteristic composure. He knew that pressing the attack into Port Napoleon would cost British lives. Lives already strained by the jungle march, the punishing climate, and the fighting at the ridge. A decisive surrender, not a destructive street battle, offered the most efficient end to the campaign. Moreover, Abercrombie understood the broader strategic picture. The British Empire needed Mauritius not in ruins, but in functioning condition, ready to serve as a new anchor for its Indian Ocean operations. Negotiations moved swiftly. Over the course of the day, French and British officers met to outline terms. The French sought honourable treatment for their soldiers and sailors, and repatriation to Europe rather than imprisonment. They asked for protections for civilians and guarantees that property would be respected under British occupation. The British, confident in their control of the situation, agreed to generous terms. They had no need for harsh measures. Victory was already complete. By the evening of 3rd December, the final articles were signed. The entire French garrison, regulars, marines, sailors, and militia, would be surrendered. They would retain their personal belongings and would eventually be transported back to France. Port Napoleon, its batteries, its fortifications, and its frigates would be handed over intact. Civil authorities would acknowledge British control, but continue operating under supervision during the transition period. With the stroke of a pen, French Mauritius ceased to exist. At dawn on the following morning, British troops marched formally into Port Napoleon. The silence was remarkable. Gone was the roar of battle. In its place, only the rhythmic tramp of boots echoed against the walls of the city. Redcoats took possession of barracks, arsenals, and strongpoints without resistance. Marines secured the harbour and boarded the once feared French frigates, now trophies of the campaign. From the ridge to the shore, British standards rose across the island. For the French soldiers gathered in the capital, the emotional weight of surrender hung heavily. Many had fought for years in isolation, cut off from the wider empire, surviving storms, disease, and British blockades. Now they faced the end of their long defiance. For British soldiers, there was relief and quiet pride. The campaign represented a triumph not only of arms, but of endurance. They had crossed dangerous seas, survived a brutal march, and faced down a tenacious enemy in unforgiving terrain. By noon, the Union flag flew above Port Napoleon, signaling to every ship and settlement within sight that the Indian Ocean had changed hands. With this single victory, the British eliminated the last French base in eastern waters and secured the maritime lifeline to India that Napoleon had sought so desperately to disrupt. Ile-de-France was renamed Mauritius, now a British possession. And though the soldiers' work was finished, history would long remember how a handful of determined Redcoats, no more than a reinforced battalion, had broken the line that guarded an empire at the edge of the world. With the fall of Port Napoleon and the formal surrender of Pamsi 3rd December 1810, a profound transformation swept across the Indian Ocean. The British, having overcome storms, disease, reefs, and one of the most experienced French colonial administrations in the empire, now stood supreme in a region that had for years been contested violently by rival fleets. The capture of Mauritius marked not simply the end of a campaign, but the conclusion of an era. French power, once formidable in these waters, was extinguished in a matter of days. For the soldiers of Maillet's, Major General Abercrombie's army, the shift from battlefield chaos to occupation duty was stark. Only hours earlier, they had fought across ridgelines and through cane fields. Now they marched in ordered ranks through streets lined with civilians, some anxious, some curious, some resigned. The British made deliberate efforts to enforce discipline, keen to reassure the population that the conquest would bring stability rather than plunder. Patrols moved quietly through neighborhoods, securing public buildings, storehouses, and administrative centers. Officers inspected batteries and magazines that had once guarded the harbor. In many places, French officials cooperated fully, recognizing that resistance was now impossible. The harbor itself, previously the beating heart of French activity in the region, became a symbol of the British triumph. The French frigates, Astrée, Bellone, Manche, Minerve, and others, rested quietly at anchor, their decks subdued, their colors replaced by the Union flag. British Marines stepped aboard, securing documents, armaments, and equipment. For the Royal Navy, long harassed by these ships, their capture represented a final closure to years of frustration. The very vessels that had preyed upon British commerce now became prizes of the empire they once hunted. Across the island, French troops prepared for repatriation. Many expressed relief that the terms allowed them to return to France rather than face imprisonment. Others carried the heavy weight of defeat, conscious that the fall of Mauritius would echo across Europe. Among the regular soldiers and naval marines, the sense of exhaustion was palpable. They had fought well, often in harsh conditions, but their isolation and dwindling numbers had made the British victory inevitable once the invasion force landed in full strength. Meanwhile, the British began transforming the island's infrastructure to serve their strategic needs. Engineers inspected fortifications, marked weak points, and planned upgrades. Naval officers evaluated the harbor's depth, anchorage potential, and supply facilities. Mauritius would now serve as a British outpost, a stepping stone between southern Africa and the vast territories of India. The island's location made it uniquely valuable, capable of supporting fleets, convoys, and communication across the empire's eastern expanse. In the following weeks, British administrators worked to stabilize the newly captured colony. They preserved French civil law, reduced tensions among the population, and restored the rhythms of daily life. Trade resumed. Ships entered the harbor without fear of predation. Merchants who had long endured disruptions from French raiding now saw a future of safer routes and predictable commerce. The British presence ensured that convoys bound for India, the Cape, and Southeast Asia would no longer face the threat of ambush by fast French frigates emerging from Mauritius's protective reefs. As news of the victory spread across the Indian Ocean, British settlements and naval stations responded with celebration. The capture of Mauritius eliminated the final French refuge in the region. a refuge that had allowed ambitious commanders like Hamelin and Duperrey to terrorize shipping for years. From Bombay to Calcutta, from the Cape to Madras, the empire breathed easier. The long war in the east had shifted decisively in Britain's favor. The French, too, understood the magnitude of the loss. With Isle Bonaparte already in British hands since July, Mauritian resistance had represented the last flicker of French influence in the Orient. Napoleon had once hoped to challenge British dominance in India. Now that hope lay extinguished on the slopes outside Port Napoleon, French prisoners awaited transportation home. Their careers in colonial warfare ended by a campaign marked by British preparation, naval dominance, and relentless resolve. For the men who had marched through the choking jungle from Grand Bay, roughly 800 redcoats, sepoys and marines, forming the point of the British spear, the sense of accomplishment was profound. They had faced not only an enemy army, but nature itself. The suffocating heat had claimed officers and soldiers before the battle even began. The jungle had threatened to sap their strength long before they reached Vandermason's line. Yet they had endured. Their disciplined advance, unbroken volleys, and determined flanking maneuvers had shattered the final French defense and opened the road to victory. In the months following the conquest, Mauritius was gradually integrated into the British Empire, its strategic value recognized immediately. The island's name was anglicized, but its character remained a blend of European, African, and Asian influences, shaped by centuries of settlement and trade. Under British governance, it became a hub for maritime operations, a center for commerce, and a vital link in the long chain of imperial supply. Though the campaign had been brief, its effects were long-lasting. By removing France's presence from the region, the British secured their maritime corridor and protected the lifeline to India that had always been the crown jewel of their empire. The soldiers who fought here, many of whose names remain recorded only in regimental rolls, had played a decisive role in shaping this new order. Years later, historians would view the fall of Mauritius as a turning point in the Eastern theatre of the Napoleonic Wars. It was a triumph of planning, logistics, and the unyielding discipline of the British infantry. It was also a reminder that in distant corners of the world, battles of enormous strategic value could hinge on the actions of a few hundred exhausted men pushing through jungle heat toward an enemy line. Their march, their fight, and their victory had reshaped an ocean. In the years that followed the British conquest of Mauritius, the events of late November and early December 1810 remained etched into the military memory of the empire. What had unfolded on that tropical island, far from the great continental battles of Europe, proved just as consequential as many of Napoleon's more famous defeats. The campaign demonstrated that control of the world's oceans could be determined not only by fleet engagements, but by the grit of infantrymen advancing through jungle, the discipline of naval brigades hauling guns across rough ground, and the strategic patience of commanders working in distant theatres. The British had entered the Indian Ocean War determined to halt French predation on their trade routes. Before the campaign, French frigates had acted as swift predators, stalking British convoys, capturing merchant vessels loaded with spices, cotton, tea, and treasure. Every successful French raid resonated through London and Calcutta alike, shaking confidence in sea power and threatening the lifelines that bound the empire together. But with the fall of Mauritius, those raids ceased entirely. The French fleet was gone, its crews returned to Europe under parole, and the island's harbours now served British interests exclusively. For the Royal Navy, the impact was immediate and profound. The menace that had haunted the convoys was gone. Ships could pass the Indian Ocean without the constant fear of interception by enemy frigates lurking behind reefs or hidden within fortified bays. Commodores and admirals across the region recognized that the capture of Mauritius had turned the ocean from a contested frontier into a British-dominated waterway. The empire's eastern flank, once vulnerable, had become secure. For the British Army, the campaign became a case study in the power of well-coordinated amphibious operations. The invasion demonstrated how naval strength, logistics, and disciplined infantry could combine to overcome not only human opposition, but the formidable challenges of terrain and climate. Redcoats who survived the march through the choking jungle recalled the suffocating air, the relentless heat, and the deadly toll it took. Officers like Captain Yates and Lieutenant Dove, whose names faded into history except in regimental accounts of the march. Their sacrifices, along with those of the sepoys, marines, and sailors who endured alongside them, underscored how victory in distant lands often demanded more from men than musket fire alone. The campaign also elevated the reputations of those who led it. Lit Col. Henry Sheehy Keating emerged as one of the British Empire's most capable leaders in expeditionary warfare. His steady guidance through the jungle and his coordination of the decisive advance upon Van der Meisen's line became textbook examples of how to command a composite force in difficult terrain. Major General John Abercrombie, whose career had included capture, imprisonment, and return to service, demonstrated unwavering strategic clarity and organizational skill throughout the campaign. Vice Admiral Albemarle Bertie and Commodore Josias Rowley, through serial raids, blockades, and careful preparation, had set the stage for the final conquest. Together, they had orchestrated a campaign that unfolded with the precision of a well-executed maneuver. For the French, the loss of Mauritius marked the end of a bold but ultimately unsustainable bid to challenge Britain's maritime supremacy in the East. Commanders like General Deccan, General Van der Meisen, Hamelin, and Duperrey had fought valiantly under extreme isolation, maintaining an active presence far from France, despite dwindling resources and overwhelming odds. The Battle of Grand Port, celebrated on the Arc de Triomphe, remained a proud moment of French naval history. But the final reality was clear. Without reinforcements, without the ability to escape the tightening grip of British naval power, and without the numbers to withstand a full-scale invasion, the defence of Mauritius had always depended on delaying the inevitable. Once Keating's vanguard broke through the ridge, the chapter closed swiftly. For Mauritius itself, the transition to British rule ushered in a new era. Civil society continued with surprisingly little disruption, protected by the generous surrender terms offered by Abercrombie. Plantation owners resumed their work, merchants reopened their shops, and the multicultural population, French settlers, free people of colour, enslaved labourers, Indian migrants, and others, adjusted to the rhythms of a new administration. The island's strategic importance grew in the decades that followed, serving as a vital node for British communication, trade, and naval operations, stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the Bay of Bengal. Yet for all the sweeping changes in diplomacy, commerce, and imperial rivalry, the essence of the campaign rested in a singular truth. The conquest of Mauritius hinged on the resilience of roughly 800 men, forming the vanguard of the invasion. Exhausted, dehydrated, and battered by the climate, these soldiers had pressed relentlessly through the jungle, held formation under intense fire, and executed the flanking movements that shattered the last French field army in the region. Their march across those 5 miles of jungle, and their resolve in the face of terrain and enemy alike, became the pivot on which the entire operation turned. From a broader perspective, the Mauritius campaign demonstrated how strategic outcomes in global conflicts could hinge on battles fought far from Europe's grand theatres. The Napoleonic Wars were wars of continents and oceans, and the victory at Mauritius played its part in shaping the world that followed. It underscored the importance of naval bases, choke points, and colonial outposts. It revealed that empires could be won or lost, not only by sweeping victories at places like Austerlitz or Waterloo, but by determined operations in remote corners of the world, where small groups of soldiers, sailors, and officers fought battles that carried weight beyond the horizon. When historians later traced the long arc of British naval dominance in the 19th century, many pointed to Mauritius as a turning point, an instance where foresight, planning, and coordination achieved what brute force alone could not. The island became a jewel in the Indian Ocean, a protector of trade routes and a symbol of imperial reach. And at the heart of this triumph stood the men who had endured the unendurable, marched through the unpassable, and broken the unbreakable line. Their story remains embedded within the broader narrative of empire, a reminder of how small numbers, guided by discipline and purpose, can alter the course of history. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.